she came for a job. She found 5 children no one wanted, and a man hiding the one secret that could destroy everything. She stepped off that stagecoach with one bag, $32, and the kind of hope that only grows in people who've already lost everything once. What waited for her wasn't the respectable household she'd been promised. It was a lie. It was chaos. It was 5 pairs of eyes staring at her like she was the last candle in a very dark room. She should have turned around. She almost did. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. The stagecoach smelled like sweat, leather, and something dead that nobody had bothered to find yet. Hazel Bennett had been sitting in that cramped, rattling box for 11 hours. Her spine felt like it had been rearranged by someone who'd never seen a human spine before. The woman across from her, a merchant's wife from Santa Fe, wide as she was tall, wearing a hat with a dead bird on it, had fallen asleep somewhere around the 3rd hour and hadn't stopped snoring since. The man beside Hazel, a cattle buyer who'd introduced himself 3 times as though he kept forgetting he'd already done it, had given up trying to make conversation around hour 6. Hazel was grateful for the silence. She pressed her forehead against the wooden frame of the window and watched New Mexico territory roll past in shades of red and brown and bleached bone white. It was nothing like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had trees and green hills and the kind of soft, forgiving landscape that didn't seem like it was actively trying to kill you. This place, this enormous, flat, merciless place, looked like the earth itself had given up. She'd chosen it anyway. The letter was folded in the inside pocket of her coat, worn soft at the creases from how many times she'd unfolded and refolded it over the past 3 weeks. She didn't need to read it again. She'd memorized it. Dear Miss Bennett, I am in need of a housekeeper of good character and sound constitution. The position is a permanent one, offering room and board in addition to fair wages. The work is considerable, but the household is orderly. I require someone capable, reliable, and accustomed to hard work. If this describes you, I hope you will consider making the journey to Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, where I run a cattle operation of some size. Respectfully, C. Mercer. Orderly household. That was what she'd held on to. Those 2 words. She'd read them so many times she'd started to see them in her sleep. Orderly household. She needed orderly. She needed something that was the opposite of the past 4 years of her life, which had been anything but. Her mother had died in the winter of 1878. Her father, a stubborn, quietly despairing man who'd never learned how to want things for himself, had followed 8 months later. Not from illness. From the particular kind of grief that takes hold in men who built their entire lives around one person and then find themselves with nothing to anchor to. The doctor had written heart failure on the certificate. Hazel hadn't corrected him. After that, she'd stayed in their house in Whitmore, Pennsylvania for 2 more years. Tried to make it work. Took in sewing, cooked for a neighboring widow in exchange for company and sometimes a meal. Watched the savings dwindle and the winters get longer and the walls close in a little more each season. She was 26 years old and she felt 70. The advertisement in the Pittsburgh Courier had seemed like an answer to something she'd stopped praying for. Housekeeping position, permanent, New Mexico territory. Wages and board included. Reply to C. Mercer, Harlow Creek. She'd written that same day. The correspondence had been brief. 3 letters total. Mercer's responses were short, almost curt. The letters of a man who found writing an inconvenience, but recognized it as necessary. He'd confirmed the wages, confirmed the accommodations, confirmed that the position was available immediately. He hadn't said much else. She hadn't asked much else. Maybe that was her first mistake. Harlow Creek wasn't a town so much as a collection of buildings that had given up on being a town. There was a general store, a livery stable, a post office that appeared to also function as a barber shop, and a saloon that looked like the most prosperous establishment on the block by some margin. The stagecoach stopped in front of the general store, and Hazel climbed down stiffly, her bag in one hand and her hat in the other, and stood in the street while the driver threw luggage down from the roof with complete indifference to what it might contain. She looked around. No one was waiting for her. She waited 20 minutes. The merchant's wife collected her things and waddled away. The cattle buyer tipped his hat and disappeared into the saloon. The stagecoach driver climbed back up and left without a word to anyone. The street settled back into the particular quiet of a place where not much happened and no one expected it to. Hazel picked up her bag and walked into the general store. The man behind the counter was old enough that he seemed to have been built at the same time as the building. He looked up when she came in, his expression suggesting she was the mildest surprise he'd had all month. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon. I'm looking for the Mercer Ranch. I'm the new housekeeper." Something moved across the old man's face. It wasn't quite a wince. It was the expression of someone who knows something they're deciding whether or not to share. "Mercer Place is about 4 miles northeast," he said. "Follow the main road until you hit the fork at the dead cottonwood. Take the left branch." "Is there someone who could give me a ride?" "My boy could take you in the wagon. Give me 10 minutes. She spent those 10 minutes sitting on the porch steps and watching the street. A dog crossed it. A crow landed on the general store's roof, looked at her with what seemed like professional skepticism, and flew away. The storekeeper's son, who was himself at least 40, which made Hazel reconsider the father's age considerably, pulled around with a mule and a flatbed wagon that had seen better decades. He didn't say much on the drive out. Neither did she. The landscape changed as they moved away from town. Or rather, it stayed exactly the same, but the empty space between things grew larger. The sky pressed down bigger and wider than any sky she'd seen before. Mountains cut the western horizon, still capped with snow that looked wrong, too white against the brown everything else. She was starting to feel very, very far from Pennsylvania. "You been out this way before?" the storekeeper's son asked, not looking at her. "No, I've never been to New Mexico." A pause. Is the Mercer Ranch a large operation?" Another pause. Longer. "Used to be larger." She waited for him to say more. He didn't. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "do you know him?" "Everybody knows everybody out here." "What's he like?" The man was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then he said, "He's had a hard couple of years. Man does the best he can, I suppose." "What do you mean, hard couple years?" But they turned onto the left branch at the dead cottonwood, and ahead, over a low rise, the outline of a ranch came into view, and the storekeeper's son seemed to decide that the conversation was over. Her first impression of the Mercer Ranch was that it was exhausted. That was the only word for it. The main house was a solid enough structure, 2 stories, wood frame, built by someone who'd known what they were doing, but it had a defeated look about it. Paint peeling away in long strips, a shutter hanging loose on one upstairs window, not quite closed and not quite open. The yard between the house and the barn was a hard-packed dirt mess of abandoned things. A broken wheel, a rusted plow blade, a child's wooden toy half buried in the dust. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told her something. "Here you are," the storekeeper's son said, pulling the wagon to a stop. He didn't offer to help her with her bag. She took it herself and climbed down. The front door of the house opened. A man came out. He was tall, taller than she'd pictured somehow, though she wasn't sure why she'd pictured anything, with dark hair badly in need of a cut and the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outside and not sleeping enough. He was wearing a collarless work shirt and canvas trousers that were clean but wrinkled, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who was tired down to the bone. He was younger than she'd expected, too. Mid-30s, maybe. Not the older, settled rancher she'd constructed in her mind. He looked at her wagon the way you look at a problem you've been half expecting and still aren't ready for. "Miss Bennett," he said. Not a question. A confirmation, reluctant. "Mr. Mercer?" She waited for him to come down the porch steps and greet her properly. He didn't move. "I arrived on the afternoon stage." "I know. I meant to meet you in town." He paused. "I got held up." "That's all right." It was quiet. The storekeeper's son clicked his tongue at the mule and turned the wagon around and headed back down the drive without so much as a goodbye. Cole Mercer looked at her bag, then at her, then at something over her left shoulder, as if there might be a better solution coming from that direction. "You should come in," he said finally. "Get some water. You'll be hungry." She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door, and that was when she understood that something was very, very wrong. The smell hit her first. Not a terrible smell, not the smell of rot or neglect exactly, but the smell of a house where no one had been managing things. Dust and old cooking smells and unwashed clothes, and the particular staleness that builds up when windows don't get opened and floors don't get swept, and no one is keeping track. Then the noise. From somewhere upstairs, two children were arguing at full volume. From the kitchen, she could hear a rhythmic banging that she couldn't immediately identify. And beneath all of it, just barely audible, the thin, high sound of an infant crying. Hazel stopped walking. She stood in the front hallway of the Mercer house and took stock. The parlor to her left was recognizable as a parlor only because of the furniture. There was a settee, a rocking chair, a side table. But the settee had clothes piled on it. The rocking chair had been turned to face the wall for no apparent reason, and the side table had a collection of objects on it that included a broken bridle, 3 tin cups, a single boot, and what appeared to be a bird's nest. The stairs in front of her had a collection of debris on nearly every step. More clothes, a boot jack, what looked like several months' worth of newspapers. The hallway floor hadn't been swept recently, or at all recently. And that crying kept going, thin and desperate, from somewhere she couldn't see yet. Cole Mercer had stopped walking too. He was standing at the base of the stairs with his back to her, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that he knew exactly what she was seeing and was bracing for her reaction. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "it's not—" He stopped, started again. "It looks worse than it is. How many children do you have?" A pause. 5. The number landed like a stone. "Your letter said the household was orderly." "I know what the letter said. You told me." She stopped herself, took a breath. "You have 5 children." "Yes. And an infant. Margaret, she's 7 months. And you described this as an orderly household." He turned around then. His expression was the particular complicated expression of a man who knows he's done something wrong and is not sure whether to apologize or defend himself, or simply wait to see what happens. He looked tired. More tired than tired. He looked like a man who'd been running on nothing for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have something. "I needed someone to come," he said. His voice was flat, not soft. "I tried the truth first. 3 women turned me down before they even finished reading the letter. So you lied." I simplified. "Mr. Mercer." She set her bag down on the floor because she needed her hands free, and she wasn't sure why. "I traveled from Pennsylvania. I left my home. I had $32 to my name, and I spent most of it getting here because you told me this was a respectable housekeeping position in an orderly household." "It is a housekeeping position." "And the household?" He had nothing to say to that. The infant's crying went up in pitch, then cut off suddenly, then started again. "I need to—" He gestured toward the kitchen. "Go," she said. She stood in the hallway alone while he disappeared into the back of the house. The arguing upstairs continued. Something crashed. A child's voice yelled, "It wasn't me!" with the practiced automatic quality of someone who said it constantly regardless of circumstances. Hazel looked at the front door. She could walk right back out through it. It was an option. It was, in fact, the sensible option. She had been deceived. She had no legal obligation to anyone in this house. She could go back to Harlow Creek tonight, sleep in the hotel if there was one, and figure out in the morning how to get herself back east. She could leave. She picked up her bag. She got as far as the porch. She was standing at the top of the porch steps with her bag in her hand and the late afternoon sun turning everything amber and red, and she was calculating how much money she had left, whether there was a hotel in Harlow Creek, what her options were in the morning, when the front door opened behind her. She turned. A child stood in the doorway. A small girl, 4 years old, maybe 5, in a dress that had been washed recently but not ironed and was a size too large. She had dark hair like her father's, tangled and unbrushed, and her feet were bare despite the fact that the air was cooling fast. She was looking at Hazel with enormous brown eyes that didn't have any particular expression in them. Not pleading, not crying, just looking. "Are you going?" the girl asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple question, with the resigned undertone of someone who'd seen people leave before and had already incorporated the possibility as a fact of life. Hazel stopped. The girl walked to the edge of the porch. She reached out and took Hazel's free hand in both of hers. Her hands were small and cold, and she held on with a grip that was surprisingly firm for someone her size. She didn't say anything else. She just held on. Inside the house, the infant was still crying. The argument upstairs had escalated. She could make out words now. 2 boys' voices. Something about a knife, which was alarming. From the kitchen came the sound of something burning, and Cole Mercer's voice saying a word she couldn't quite make out, but could make an educated guess at. The small girl with the cold hands looked up at her. "I'm Emma," she said. Hazel looked at her bag, looked at the door, looked down at Emma's face, which held no guile in it at all, only the matter-of-fact patience of a child who'd learned to wait without expecting much. She set her bag down. "I'm Hazel," she said. Emma nodded, as if this were satisfactory, and led her back inside. The kitchen was a disaster. That was not an exaggeration. The kitchen was a genuine, comprehensive disaster. Dishes stacked in the dry sink and on the counter and on the small table in the corner. The floor had things on it that she decided not to identify immediately. The cast iron range had something blackened and smoking in a pot on it, and Cole Mercer was standing over it with a rag in his hand, looking at the contents with the expression of a man who has accepted defeat. Hazel went to the range, moved him aside with a firm press of her hand on his forearm, and took the pot off the heat. She looked inside. What was this supposed to be? "Beans," he said. "When did you put them on?" "This morning." "Without water?" "I added water." "Enough water?" He was quiet for a moment. Apparently not enough water. She set the ruined pot in the dry sink and looked at the kitchen properly, taking inventory the way her mother had taught her. Not starting with what was wrong, but starting with what was there to work with. There was flour, there were some eggs, a few left, salt pork hanging near the back door, dried corn, lard. In the corner of the kitchen, in a wooden cradle that had been propped up on one side with a folded blanket to keep it level, the infant lay in the last stages of crying herself out. Not the full-throated screaming of before, but the hiccuping, exhausted aftermath. The kind of crying that comes when a baby has been crying long enough that she's forgotten what she was crying about, but keeps going from sheer inertia. Hazel crouched down beside the cradle. The baby, Margaret, was 7 months and small for it, with Cole's dark hair and an expression of profound indignation that Hazel found she understood completely. She picked her up. The baby startled, then didn't, then pressed her wet face against Hazel's neck and made a sound that was not quite crying anymore. "She needs feeding," Hazel said, standing with the baby against her shoulder. "I know." Cole's voice had something in it she couldn't identify. Not embarrassment exactly, something worse than embarrassment. "She takes cow's milk now. Is there milk?" "In the cold box. But she doesn't always—" "Get it." He got it. Hazel stood in the middle of that disastrous kitchen and patted the baby's back while Cole Mercer, a grown man who ran a cattle operation, went to the cold box and found the milk with the uncertain movements of someone who was doing this because he had to, not because he knew what he was doing. "Do you have a bottle?" "A what?" She looked at him. "A feeding bottle for the baby. She's been eating. I've been using a—" He went to a shelf and produced a small tin cup with a rag tied over the top, a hole poked through. A makeshift thing. It would work, barely. It had clearly been working barely. "Fine," Hazel said. "Warm the milk, gently." The 2 boys upstairs had not stopped fighting. After she'd gotten Margaret settled, the baby sucking milk from the improvised bottle with the single-minded intensity of someone who'd been waiting a very long time, Hazel handed her to Cole with simple instructions and went upstairs to find out what was happening. The stairs were worse in person than they'd looked from the bottom. She moved the worst of the clutter aside as she went, creating a path. At the top, a narrow hallway with 4 doors, 2 on each side. The arguing was coming from behind the second door on the right. She knocked once. No response. She opened the door. 2 boys, roughly 8 and 10 years old, were engaged in what could only be described as a civil war. The older one had something in his hand, not a knife, thankfully, but a folding ruler, and the younger one was holding a boot over his head in a defensive posture. They were both red-faced and fully committed to whatever they were fighting about, and neither of them noticed her for a good 3 seconds. Then they both stopped and looked at her. She looked back. "Who are you?" the older one demanded. "My name is Miss Bennett. Who are you?" James, he lowered the ruler slightly. He took my book. Did not? Did. I just borrowed it. Without asking. Because you would have said no. Because you ruin everything you touch. I do not.
Enough. She said it quietly, not loudly, not in the sharp, cutting way that made children flinch, but in the flat way that meant she was not going to say it again. Both boys went quiet with the instinctive response children have to adults who have learned that volume is not the point. "What's your name?" she said to the younger one. "Will. Will, give the book back." He has to say please. "James." The older boy's jaw tightened. "Please," he said, making it sound like a minor injury.
Will handed the book over. Then they both stood there looking at her. "This room is a mess," she said. "It's always a mess," James said. "Not anymore." She looked around, clothes on the floor, on the bed, hanging off the edge of a trunk, a collection of rocks and feathers and other boy detritus covering the windowsill. Months of entropy accumulating in layers. "You'll clean it before supper." "We don't have supper," Will said. Not with self-pity, just as a fact. Pa usually forgets. That landed somewhere in her chest, in a place she wasn't expecting. "You'll have supper tonight," she said. "Go on." She found the other two children, girls, this one about 12, and the other perhaps 9, in the room at the end of the hall. The 12-year-old was sitting on the bed with her knees pulled up and a look on her face that had calcified into something so habitual it no longer needed effort to maintain. A look that said, "I have decided not to need anything, and so far it's working." The 9-year-old was sitting on the floor, drawing in the dust on the floorboards with her finger, making no particular shapes, just lines. Both of them looked up when Hazel came in. "I'm Miss Bennett," she said. "I know," the 12-year-old said. "Pa said someone was coming." A pause. "You didn't leave?" "Not yet." Something in the older girl's face shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite hope. More like the careful preliminary of hope. The thing you feel before you let yourself feel hope, when you're trying to determine whether it's safe. "I'm Ruth," she said. "This is Clara." Clara, 9 years old, looked up from the floor. She had the same dark hair as all of them, and a gap between her front teeth and an expression considerably more open than her older sister's. "Are you going to cook supper?" she asked. "Yes." "Good." She went back to drawing lines in the dust. "Pa burned the beans." "I know." "He burns a lot of things." "Clara," Ruth said sharply. "It's not mean if it's true," Clara said. Hazel looked at the room. In better condition than the boys, marginally, you could tell Ruth had been making some effort, an ongoing battle against entropy that she was losing slowly but hadn't given up on entirely. Clean clothes folded in a rough stack on top of the trunk, the floor swept in one corner. "Supper in about an hour," Hazel said. "Come down when I call." She made cornbread and fried salt pork and heated up the last of a pot of dried beans that hadn't been ruined yet, the ones she found in a second pot at the back of the shelf. It wasn't much. It was what there was. While she cooked, she inventoried the kitchen properly. The situation was not good. Supplies were low. Not dangerously low, but a week away from dangerously low. The root cellar, she discovered when she opened the door at the back of the kitchen, had more in it than she'd feared. Some turnips, a sack of potatoes, dried corn, 2 crocks of something pickled. Someone had put those stores up. Probably the previous woman of the house. Cole came into the kitchen twice while she cooked. The first time he stopped in the doorway, looked at what she was doing, and said nothing. Just stood there with the particular look of someone who wants to say something and can't figure out what. Then he went back out. The second time he came to get water. "She's sleeping," he said, meaning Margaret. "Good." He filled the cup and stood by the dry sink, not leaving. "I should have—" He stopped. "Yes?" she said. "I'm not going to make excuses for the letter. I didn't ask you to. I just—" He set the cup down, put both hands flat on the counter, and looked at the window. "I need someone here. I can't—" Another stop. He wasn't good at finishing sentences that required him to say what he actually meant. "There's no one else." Hazel turned the cornbread. I haven't decided to stay, she said. I want to be clear about that. I know. I'm going to make supper. I'm going to figure out what situation I'm actually in, and in the morning I'll decide. Fair enough? And Mr. Mercer. He looked at her. Don't lie to me again. Whatever else happens here, don't lie to me again. He held her gaze for a long moment. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the kind of gray that could be blue in different light. They were also, underneath the tiredness and the guardedness, and whatever else was layered on top, essentially honest eyes. She didn't know why she thought that. She just did. All right, he said. Bopat. Supper was not a graceful event. All 5 children came to the table in various states of cleanliness and order. James and Will had made some attempt at the room. She could see the residue of hurried effort on their faces, the look of boys who've hidden things under the bed and hope no one notices. Ruth came down with Clara, both of them quiet. Emma appeared already at the table, having apparently not left the kitchen area since she'd led Hazel back inside, sitting in her oversized dress with her bare feet tucked under her on the chair, and watching everything with those steady brown eyes. Cole sat at the head of the table. He didn't say anything when the children came in, and they didn't say anything to him. They just sat. Hazel brought the food to the table and served it. For a moment, all of them just looked at the plates in front of them. Then Will picked up his fork. There's cornbread, he said. Yes, Hazel said. We haven't had cornbread in a while. Will, Ruth said under her breath. I'm just saying. Don't. James cut his pork and ate without comment. Clara ate with the focused intensity of someone who's been hungry more often than they should be and doesn't take food for granted. Emma ate carefully, deliberately, as if the act of eating deserved full attention. Cole ate without tasting it, she could tell. He ate because it was there, and he knew he should. It's good, Clara said suddenly, to no one in particular. Ruth kicked her under the table. Clara yelped. Ruth, Cole said. She's always... Ruth. Ruth went silent. The table settled into an uneasy peace, not the peace of people comfortable together, but the peace of people who'd agreed, collectively and without discussion, to table the fighting for the duration of the meal. When they were finished, the children stood up and began to drift away in their various directions without clearing anything. Stop, Hazel said. They stopped. Clear your plates, put them in the dry sink. A beat of silence in which 4 children and 1 grown man recalibrated to the fact that something had changed. Yes, ma'am, Clara said, gathering her plate. The others followed. Even Cole, after a moment, reached for his own plate. Oh, she put Emma to bed first. The little girl allowed herself to be guided upstairs, her cold hand back in Hazel's, and showed her which room she slept in. A small room at the back of the hall that she apparently shared with Margaret's cradle. The baby was still sleeping. Hazel found Emma a nightdress. It took some time. The clothes were scattered through the room in the unorganized way of a child used to doing for herself, and helped her into it. My mama used to tell me a story, Emma said, when she was settled under the quilt. Hazel sat on the edge of the bed. What kind of story? I don't remember. A pause. She's been gone a long time. I know. Do you know stories? I know a few. Tell me one. So Hazel told her the one her own mother had told her when she was small. The one about the winter bird who couldn't fly and had to walk all the way south on foot, and all the things she saw and the other animals she met, and the arguments she had along the way. It was not a very dramatic story. She'd always loved it for that. Emma was asleep before the bird reached the mountain pass. Hazel sat there a moment longer than she needed to. She found Cole on the porch when she came back downstairs. He was sitting in one of the chairs with his forearms on his knees and a cup of something, coffee, she thought, cooling in his hands, looking out at the dark ranch. She sat in the other chair without asking. For a while, neither of them said anything. How long ago? She asked. He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. 14 months, February of last year. He looked at his cup. Fever. It came on fast. Were you here? I was in Albuquerque. A pause. Stock auction. I got back 3 days after. She heard what was in that. The 3 days. The fact that he'd been gone and came back to something already irreversible. She did not say anything about it. Ruth's been the one, he started. I know. She's 12 years old and she's been trying to run this house. I know. She paused. She's exhausted. Yeah. He set the cup down on the porch railing. He rubbed one hand over his face. I keep thinking I'm managing, and then I look at it and I see that I'm not. The darkness beyond the porch was complete. No moon yet. Just stars, more of them than she'd ever seen in Pennsylvania, so many they made the sky seem closer and fuller. I'm going to stay, Hazel said. He went still. Not because of the letter, she said, and not because I think you've earned it. You lied to get me here, and that's not something I'm interested in pretending didn't happen. She looked at the stars. I'm staying because that little girl took my hand, and because Ruth is 12 years old and she's too tired, and because Margaret needs someone who knows what they're doing. She paused. And because I need somewhere to be. That's honest, too. Cole Mercer was quiet for a long time. All right, he said. I'll need to know everything about the house. The supplies, the accounts, what's been done and what's been let go. I'll tell you whatever you need. And you don't give me orders about the house. The house is my domain. You can have an opinion, but you don't give me orders. Fair. And you talk to your children, properly, at the table. They've gone too long without someone talking to them. He looked at the railing. I'm not very good at that. I know. Work on it. He almost smiled. Not quite. The muscles near his mouth moved in the direction of a smile, and then thought better of it. Yes, ma'am, he said, in a tone so close to his older son's tone that she had to work to keep her own expression even. She stood up. I'll start a proper inventory in the morning. I'll make a list of what's needed. I'll go into town. Good. She picked up her bag, which she'd left on the porch. Where do I sleep? Room at the end of the hall. Upstairs. Other side from the girls. Is it clean? A pause. Mostly. She looked at him. The floor's clean, he said. That's something. She went inside. The room at the end of the hall was, in fact, not mostly clean. It was about 40% clean, which was what happened when a person said mostly, meaning better than the rest of the house. But there was a bed with a mattress that was acceptable, and a washstand with a pitcher and a basin, both empty but present, and a window that latched. She'd made do with less. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She thought about the letter. Orderly household. She thought about Emma's cold hands and the way she'd held on without asking. She thought about Ruth's face, that 12-year-old face with the calcified look in it, the look that had been put there by 14 months of trying to be something no child should have to be. She thought about Clara eating with the focused intensity of someone who knew better than to take food for granted. She thought about Margaret's weight against her shoulder, and the way the crying had stopped when she picked her up, just stopped, as if the baby had been waiting for someone who knew what to do and had finally found her. She was $32 short of what she'd started with. She was 4 miles from a town that barely qualified as one. She was in a room that was 40% clean, in a state she'd never been to before, in a house that needed more work than she'd done in the past 2 years combined. And she was, for the first time in a very long time, not entirely sure what the next week would look like. She was, she realized, slightly less afraid of the future than she'd been this morning. She took off her boots and lay down on top of the quilt with her clothes on, because she was too tired to do anything else, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the distant low of cattle, the wind moving through whatever was between here and the mountains, and thought, one day at a time, start with tomorrow. She was asleep before she finished the thought. She woke before anyone else. That was deliberate. She'd learned it from her mother. The woman who rises first sets the tone for the whole day, and the tone of this house needed serious resetting. She was dressed and downstairs while the sky outside was still the dark gray-purple of early morning, before the sun had committed to anything, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at it the way you look at a problem you've agreed to solve but haven't quite figured out yet. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started. The first hour was just cleaning. Not the deep kind. Not yet. There wasn't time for the deep kind before anyone woke up and needed feeding, but the surface kind, the kind that makes a space feel inhabited by intention rather than chaos. She swept the floor, washed the dishes in the dry sink using water she heated on the range, wiped down the counter. found a tablecloth folded in the back of a drawer and put it on the table, even though it was faded and had a small burn mark on one corner, because a table with a cloth on it feels different from a table without one. Small things. She'd learned that too. It's always the small things that hold a household together. The range needed attention. The firebox had been loaded badly and unevenly, which explained why the heat was inconsistent, which explained why Cole Mercer burned everything he tried to cook. She cleaned out the ash box, relayed the fire, and adjusted the damper. Basic. Obvious. The kind of thing that goes wrong when no one's paying attention to it. Margaret woke at first light, which Hazel heard through the ceiling, that particular escalating sequence from murmur to fuss to full alarm. And she went upstairs and got her before she could wake Emma. The baby looked at her in the gray morning light with an expression of cautious assessment, as if she were trying to decide whether yesterday had been a fluke or a pattern. "It's not a fluke," Hazel told her, settling her on one hip and heading back down to warm the milk. "You're going to have to get used to me." Margaret grabbed a fistful of her collar and held on, which Hazel decided to take as agreement. Cole came down while she was feeding the baby. He'd shaved, she noticed. Not perfectly. There was a place near his jaw he'd missed, and his hair was still damp from water. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and took in the swept floor and the clean counter and the tablecloth, and something shifted in his expression that he managed to cover before it became readable. "Coffee's on," she said, without looking up from Margaret. He poured himself a cup and stood by the window, looking out at the barn. "I need to be out by sunup. Fence line in the north section's been down for a week." "Fine. I'll be back by midday, maybe later." "Fine." A pause. He drank his coffee. "She give you trouble in the night?" "No, she slept through." Hazel shifted the baby to her shoulder and patted her back. "She needs more regular feedings. She's underweight for 7 months. Cole's jaw tightened slightly. "I've been doing what I can." "I know you have. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm telling you what she needs." She met his eyes briefly. "More frequent, smaller amounts, and she needs to be held more. Babies that age need contact." He looked at his coffee cup. Ruth is 12 and has more than enough to manage. That's a separate conversation." He didn't argue. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the dry sink, which was, she noticed, a new behavior, since the cup from last night had been left on the counter, and went out to the barn. The house was quiet for another 20 minutes. Then it wasn't. Will came downstairs first, thundering down in the way of 9-year-old boys who have not yet learned that stairs are a shared resource. He came into the kitchen already talking, not to anyone in particular, just talking in the continuous monologue that seemed to be his natural state. "Is there breakfast? Because yesterday we had cold cornbread, and James said that doesn't count, but I said it does, if it's all there is, but he..." He stopped when he saw the kitchen, looked around, looked at the tablecloth, looked at Hazel, who was at the range now with Margaret tucked in the crook of one arm, managing the skillet with her free hand in the competent one-armed way of a woman who'd once cared for an ailing parent while also running a household. "There's eggs," she said. "Go wash your hands." "How?" She looked at him over her shoulder. He was 9. He knew how to wash his hands. He was asking something else. Where? With what? Was there water? Did someone need to pour it for him? Had the rules changed? "Washstand in the hall," she said. "There's a pitcher." He went and came back considerably cleaner, which was relative but still an improvement. James appeared behind him, already wearing that armored look of a 10-year-old who has decided that the safest emotional position is mild contempt for everything. He surveyed the kitchen in the same way Will had, but where Will's response had been open curiosity, James's was a more complicated assessment. He was looking for the catch, looking for how long this would last before it fell apart again. Hazel recognized that look. She'd worn it herself for the better part of 4 years. "Sit down," she said, in the tone that wasn't loud but wasn't optional. Both boys sat. Ruth came down with Clara, and Emma appeared from somewhere, still in her nightdress, her hair the spectacular disaster that children's hair becomes overnight. Clara sat immediately. Emma climbed into her chair and tucked her feet under her. Ruth stopped just inside the kitchen doorway and looked at everything with an expression Hazel couldn't quite read, something between relief and suspicion. The look of someone who's been responsible for a sinking ship suddenly seeing someone else with a bucket. "Can I help?" Ruth asked. Sit down with your brothers and sisters this morning, Hazel said. Tomorrow you can help. Ruth opened her mouth. You've been helping for 14 months, Hazel said quietly, not looking away from the skillet. Sit down. Ruth sat. Hazel put scrambled eggs and fried cornbread on the table. The leftover cornbread from last night, sliced and crisped in a little lard, and poured milk for the children and set Margaret in the cradle she'd carried downstairs, settling her with the easy confidence of someone who knows that a recently fed baby in a clean diaper will give you 10 minutes of peace if you position the cradle correctly. The children ate. It wasn't quiet the way last night's supper had been quiet. That managed truce, everyone careful. This was different. Will started talking about something he'd seen in the barn, and Clara argued with his description, and James told them both they were wrong with the authority of someone 2 years older, and Emma ate her eggs and watched all of them with those steady eyes and contributed nothing but seemed content. Ruth ate with one hand and used the other to bounce the cradle gently when Margaret started to fuss, automatically without being asked. It was messy and loud and imperfect, and Hazel stood at the range with her own plate and ate standing up because there wasn't a good place to sit with 6 of them at the table. And she thought, this is what it's supposed to sound like. It wasn't a warm thought exactly. It was something more complicated than warm. It was the thought you have when you recognize something you'd stopped believing existed. She cleaned up after breakfast, sent the boys outside with a list of things Cole had told her needed doing, water for the animals, wood for the range, and sat Ruth and Clara down at the table. I need to know everything about this house, she said. You two know it best. Ruth's expression shifted again, that complicated relief suspicion. What do you want to know? Everything. Where things are. What's broken. What we're out of. What your father deals with and what's been left alone. So Ruth told her, in the careful, organized way of a child who'd had to keep track of too many things for too long and had developed a system just to cope. Clara added details, some useful and some wildly tangential, and between the two of them, Hazel built a picture of the household that was more complete and more sobering than she'd expected. The roof leaked over the back bedroom when it rained hard from the northwest. The second step on the stairs was cracked and would give out eventually. The well was good, but the pulley needed replacing. The cold box worked, but the seal on one side was loose and it wasn't staying cold the way it should. 3 of the windows in the upstairs rooms didn't latch properly. The laundry situation was, in Ruth's precise phrasing, behind. Behind how far? Hazel asked. Ruth looked at the table. A few weeks, maybe. Clara held up 4 fingers. 4 weeks, Hazel said. Pa doesn't... He's been wearing the same... Ruth stopped, started again. He does what he can. I know he does. She wrote laundry on the list she was building. It was a long list. What about school? Silence. When did you last go? Ruth looked at Clara. Clara looked at the table. October, Ruth said. It was April. Hazel wrote school on the list. She underlined it once and then, looking at Ruth's face, underlined it again. The first week was hard. Not hard in any one dramatic way, but hard in the accumulated weight of 100 small things, each one manageable on its own and collectively exhausting. The laundry alone took 2 full days. She boiled water in the big copper kettle, scrubbed on the washboard until her knuckles were raw, hung line after line of clothes in the yard while Emma trailed behind her handing up clothespins with earnest efficiency. James and Will were not natural collaborators, but could be directed separately toward individual tasks as long as she was clear about what was expected and checked the results, and didn't show surprise when the results were imperfect, because showing surprise at imperfect results from a 10-year-old boy is the fastest way to stop getting any results at all. Cole was in and out. He was up before her some mornings. She'd come down to find evidence of him. The coffee already on, the door left open a crack the way he always did, a coffee cup she hadn't left in the sink. He worked long days, came back at midday sometimes, and ate whatever she'd left without comment, went back out. In the evenings, he sat at the table with the children for supper, and she could see him making the effort she'd asked for, actually talking to them, asking James about whatever he'd been reading, letting Will explain at length the fascinating thing he'd observed about one of the horses, listening with the determined attention of a man who knows he's missed something but isn't entirely sure how to get back to it. He wasn't good at it yet. There were silences where there shouldn't have been, and moments where he clearly didn't know what to say and filled the gap badly, and once he snapped at James over something small, a knocked-over glass, nothing more, and then went very still and quiet in the way of a man who's just hurt himself and doesn't like what he heard. But he kept trying. That mattered. She found him on the porch the evening of the fourth day, not long after supper, sitting with his elbows on his knees and that same cooling cup of coffee he never quite finished. "James won't talk to me," he said without preamble as she came out. She sat in the other chair. "He will. Give it time. I snapped at him yesterday." "I know. I heard." He looked at the yard. "He looks at me like I'm something he's already decided about." "You are something he's already decided about," she said. "You've been absent for over a year. Not physically, I know you've been here. But the way that matters to a 10-year-old, you haven't been here. He's decided you're not someone he can count on, and now you're trying to change his mind, and he's not sure he believes you yet." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "How do I change it?" "You just keep showing up, that's all. You keep showing up at the table and you keep talking to him even when he doesn't answer well, and eventually he'll start to believe it." "How long does that take?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Longer than a week." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Not a laugh at all, actually. More the sound you make when something is not funny, but you recognize the irony of it. "My father was the same way," he said after a moment. Not like he'd planned to say it. More like it came out because the dark and the tiredness had taken down whatever usually held it back. "When I was James' age, after my mother, there was a period where he was just..." He stopped. Gone. Sitting right there at the table and gone. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to something is just to let it breathe. "I swore I wasn't going to be that," he said. "And then you were. And then I was." He picked up the cup, set it back down. "I don't know how it happens that way. You watch someone do a thing, you hate it, you promise yourself you won't, and then..." "Grief does what it wants," she said. "It doesn't ask your permission." He looked at her. It was the first time she thought that he'd really looked at her. Not assessed her, not checked in on whether the situation was manageable, but actually looked, with the specific attention of someone trying to understand something. "You've lost people," he said. "Yes." "Who?" "My parents. Both of them, within a year of each other." She looked at the mountains, dark against the darker sky. "My mother first, then my father. He just stopped. After she was gone, he just stopped. Like he couldn't find the reason to keep going." Something like that. They were quiet together. It wasn't the uncomfortable quiet of strangers who've run out of things to say. It was the quiet of two people who've arrived at a similar place from different directions and are both a little surprised to find someone else there. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "I should have said that before now." "Her name was Catherine," he said. It sounded like a small, deliberate thing, saying her name, like he was putting it down carefully in a specific place. She would have laughed at this situation, I'll tell you that. She had a sense of humor about hard things. What was she like? He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. "Stubborn," he said. "Smart. Not very interested in being told what to do." A pause. "Ruth is like her. The look she gets when she disagrees with something but decides not to say it. That's Catherine's look exactly." "I've seen that look." "Yeah." He was quiet again. "She would have been good with this, all of it. I was always the one who wasn't sure what to say to them." "You're learning. Late. Better late than not at all." He nodded slowly, like that was something he was still deciding whether to believe. The second week was different from the first in the way that all second weeks are. The newness had worn off, and what remained was the reality, the actual daily weight of the work and the people, and the ongoing small negotiations of living together in close quarters. Clara went through a phase of following Hazel everywhere she went with a stream of questions about everything she encountered. Why did the biscuits puff up? What was the stuff that came out of the cow's nose when it was cold? How did Hazel know where north was? What had Pennsylvania looked like? Had she ever seen a real city? The questions came whether Hazel was busy or not, and didn't particularly require answers so much as an audience. And Hazel provided both when she could and redirected when she couldn't, which was its own skill. James remained cautious. He was reading constantly, she noticed. Always had a book somewhere, tucked in his back pocket or sitting open on whatever surface was nearest. She found out from Will, who had no capacity for keeping information to himself, that James had been working his way through a box of books that had been their mother's. He'd been doing it since Catherine died. She didn't try to talk to him about it. She just made sure that when he came in from his chores in the afternoon, there was always a place at the table where the light was good, and she never moved his books off it, and she didn't require him to be sociable during the time he spent reading. That was something her father had done for her once. Left a lamp in a quiet space and asked nothing. 2 weeks in, James came to the kitchen and stood in the doorway while she was rolling out dough and said, without looking at her, "I can do the kindling every morning, if you want. I know you have to do everything else." She kept rolling the dough. "That would be helpful," she said. He nodded, started to leave, stopped. "The biscuits yesterday were good," he said, still not looking at her. "We used to have them. When He stopped again. Anyway, he left before she could respond, which was fine. She wasn't sure she had the right response yet anyway. By the third week, something in the house had shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of change you could point at and name. It was the kind of change that happens underneath things, in the structure of daily life, the rhythms that people fall into when someone is paying attention to how the day is organized and what everyone needs, and whether the machine of a household has enough oil in it to run without grinding. Breakfast at the same time every morning, chores with clear expectations, meals that were hot and regular, laundry done and put away. Margaret on a feeding schedule that was already making a visible difference. She was louder now, more demanding, had opinions about things, which meant she was healthier. The children went back to school. That had required some negotiation with Cole, who'd been planning to wait until fall, and with Ruth, who'd pointed out that she didn't have any shoes that fit properly anymore, a problem they'd solved with a trip to town that Hazel managed herself, with Cole's money and her own judgment. The trip to town was informative. Harlow Creek's relationship with the Mercer Ranch was complicated, she gathered, from the way people looked at her when she introduced herself. Not hostile, more like careful. The kind of careful that means people have opinions they're not sure whether to share with a stranger. Martha Holt at the general store was less restrained than most. She was a wide, direct woman in her 50s who weighed out flour with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times and saw no reason to pretend social niceties were more important than the actual transaction. "You're the new girl out at Mercer's," she said, not a question. "I'm the housekeeper, yes." "How long you planning to stay?" Hazel measured out the money for the flour. "Long enough." Martha looked at her over the counter. "3 women before you. One lasted 4 days. The second one didn't even go inside, took one look at the yard and turned the wagon around. The third one stayed 2 weeks and left crying." "That's useful to know," Hazel said pleasantly. "Those kids need somebody who'll stick." "I know they do." Martha weighed her up for a moment longer, then nodded in the decisive way of someone who makes assessments quickly and trusts them. "You need anything that's not on your list, you come see me. Sometimes I have surplus I haven't put out yet, eggs especially." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Martha said. "Wait and see if it's actually useful." Cole was in the barn when she got back, doing something complicated with a piece of harness. He looked up when she came in. She'd found him out there because she needed help unloading, which she'd decided to ask for directly, rather than manage herself and resent it. "Martha Holt said I was the 4th housekeeper you've tried," she said. He went still. "You didn't mention that in the letter either," she said. "No." "Was there anything else you didn't mention?" He set the harness down and looked at her with the honest eyes that she'd clocked on the first day and still wasn't quite sure what to do with. "The roof over the back bedroom leaks," he said, "and the second step on the stairs is going to go through one of these days." "I know about those. Ruth told me." "Then I think you know everything." "I'm going to need more than what you gave me for supplies this week." "I know. The children need clothes. Ruth is wearing things that are too small, and the boys go through everything faster than it can be mended. And Emma needs shoes. Those ones she has are, I'll get you more money. It's not a small amount." "I know what my children need," he said quietly. Not defensively, just quietly. She nodded. "Let it be." She was turning to go when he said, "She said what?" "Martha Holt, that 3 women left before me." "She tell you anything else?" that the second one turned around in the yard. Something moved across his face. Not embarrassment, the more private kind of shame, the kind that comes from seeing yourself the way other people have seen you and finding that the picture is accurate. "I let things go," he said. "I knew I was letting things go, and I couldn't stop it. After Catherine," he stopped himself, picked the harness back up. "I couldn't find the place to start." She stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light coming in behind her and thought about her father's house after her mother died. The dishes she'd washed alone, the floors she'd swept alone, the long evenings alone, and the particular way that grief makes ordinary tasks feel like insults. Why should you sweep the floor when the person who made the house worth sweeping for is gone? "I know what that's like," she said. He looked at her. "Not the same way, but I know what it's like to not be able to find the place to start." She paused. "The place to start is always the smallest thing in front of you. That's not wisdom, it's just what works." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. She went inside to put the supplies away. That evening, she heard him upstairs with the children after supper. She was washing up in the kitchen, and she could hear, through the ceiling, the low murmur of his voice, and then the higher counterpoint of Will's and Clara's, and then James saying something in a tone that wasn't contemptuous for once, and Cole's response, which made all three of them laugh. She stood at the dry sink with water going cold on her hands and listened to it, and didn't think about anything in particular, and didn't try to name what she was feeling. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightdress. "Miss Hazel." "It's past your bedtime, Emma." "I know." The little girl walked across the kitchen with the deliberate dignity of someone who has made a decision and intends to follow through on it. She hugged Hazel's leg, didn't say anything, didn't ask for anything, just pressed her face against Hazel's side and held on for a moment. Then she let go, turned around, and walked back upstairs. Hazel stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, looking at nothing in particular, her hands still wet, listening to the sound of the family she'd stumbled into doing what families did, being imperfect and loud and complicated and alive together. And she thought about the woman who'd gotten on that stagecoach in Pennsylvania with $32 and a folded letter and a deep, specific kind of loneliness. She thought about orderly household. She thought that she hadn't understood, when she'd read those words, what kind of order she was actually looking for. Not the order of swept floors and straight lines, though those mattered. Something else. Something underneath that. The order that comes when people know where they belong and can feel it without having to think about it. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been 3 weeks ago. The house was quieter than it had been. The children were fed and shod and back in school. Margaret was gaining weight. The second step on the stairs was still cracked, and the roof over the back bedroom still leaked. And Cole Mercer was still a man who didn't know how to finish sentences that required him to say what he actually meant. None of that was fixed. None of it was close to fixed. But something had started. She could feel it in the way the house breathed around her, the way a place starts to feel different when it's being paid attention to. She dried her hands and went to check on the baby before bed. The trouble with settling into a place, Hazel had learned, was that it made you vulnerable in ways that leaving never did. Leaving was clean. Leaving meant you kept everything important packed tight against yourself, nothing spread out, nothing exposed. But staying meant you started to put things down. You left your book open on the table because you'd be back for it. You planted things in a garden because you expected to be there when they came up. You let yourself get used to the sound of a particular house at night, the way the wind came off the mountains around 2 a.m. and moved through the gap under the back door, the way Margaret's breathing changed when she fell into the deep part of sleep, the way Cole's boots sounded on the porch steps, heavier on the left foot than the right from some old injury he'd never mentioned. You let yourself get used to people. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. By the end of the second month, Hazel had gotten used to all of it. She hadn't meant to. She'd been careful, or thought she'd been, keeping that interior distance, that practical awareness that she was an employee, that this was a job, that the children weren't hers, and the ranch wasn't hers, and Cole Mercer's gray eyes, and his half-finished sentences, and the way he sometimes stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before remembering why he'd come in. None of that was hers. She knew better. She'd been telling herself she knew better for 2 months. But Emma still took her hand every morning. Margaret had started reaching for her specifically, that deliberate infant reach with both arms that means you, I want you. Clara told her things, the small private things that children only tell people they trust, about a girl at school who'd been unkind, about a dream that had scared her, about the rock she'd found by the creek that she was almost certain had a face in it. Will reported to her at the end of every day the way a soldier reports to a general, a full accounting of everything that had happened and everything he'd observed and every conclusion he'd drawn, because he'd discovered that she would actually listen and occasionally confirm that his conclusions were sound. James had started leaving books on the kitchen table with certain passages marked, not with any explanation, just the book, open to the page, as if by accident, as if he'd left it there and forgotten it, and she could look or not look, no pressure either way. She always looked. She never mentioned it to him directly, but once she'd mentioned, in the general conversation at supper, that she'd read something interesting once about the way rivers changed course over decades, and James had looked up from his plate with an expression of such unguarded surprise that she'd had to focus very carefully on the butter dish to keep her face even. Ruth was the one that concerned her most, and also the one she was most careful with. Ruth was getting better. In the slow way that people get better when they've been carrying too much weight and someone takes some of it from their hands, but they don't yet trust that the taking is permanent. She was sleeping later in the mornings now that Hazel was up first. She'd stopped doing that automatic scan of the kitchen every time she came downstairs. The quick inventory of what wasn't done, what needed handling, what would fall apart without her. She'd started coming home from school and doing her lessons at the table instead of doing chores first, which was how it should be. 12 years old and doing lessons. But there were moments when Margaret cried and Ruth was the first to move toward the sound, when she stood up from the supper table and reached for plates before anyone asked her to, when she watched Hazel managing something and got that particular look on her face, assessing and measuring and making notes, where Hazel could see exactly what the last 14 months had made her. A girl who'd been required to be older than she was and had become it, and didn't entirely know how to put it back down. Hazel didn't push. She just kept taking things from Ruth's hands, gently and consistently, and waited. Cole, for his part, had found his way to the table. It hadn't happened all at once. There'd been no single moment of breakthrough, no conversation that fixed everything. That wasn't how people worked, and Hazel knew better than to look for it. What had happened was slower and less elegant. Cole had kept showing up, kept talking to the children at supper, even when it was awkward and stilted, kept checking in on Margaret's weight and listening when Hazel told him what the baby needed, kept saying goodnight to each of them individually in the evenings, which she suspected was new. James was still cautious, still kept that careful distance, but he'd stopped wearing the armored look quite so constantly, and once, about a month in, Hazel had come around the side of the barn and found him showing Cole something in one of his books. A map, she thought, something historical. And Cole was leaning down to look at it with genuine attention, and James was explaining something with his hands, and neither of them noticed her for a full minute. She backed around the side of the barn and went the other way. Some things you didn't interrupt. The storm came on a Thursday in late June, with very little warning. She'd seen the clouds building to the southwest that morning, the heavy, greenish dark kind that meant business, and mentioned it to Cole at breakfast. He'd looked out the window and said he'd get the north fence done before it hit. And he'd left, and the morning had gone on the way mornings did. Children to school, baby down for her morning sleep, a batch of bread to set. The week's mending she'd been working through methodically. By noon the wind had picked up. By 2 o'clock the sky had turned the color of a bruise, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and Hazel was going through the house, latching every window and weighing down anything on the porch that could move. She'd sent a ranch hand, a thin, quiet man named Obie, who worked for Cole and boarded in the barn loft, to bring the horses in, and he'd done it wordlessly with the efficient calm of someone who'd worked this land long enough to read a sky. "This one's going to be bad," Obie said, coming into the barn aisle with the last 2 horses, not looking at her with any alarm, which she found more alarming than alarm would have been. "How bad?" "Hard to say. Seen 'em blow through fast, seen 'em sit for 2 days. He glanced at the southwest sky. "Cole still out there?" She looked at the road. Empty. "He said he'd be back before it hit," she said. Obie didn't respond to that, which was its own kind of response. He went about settling the horses, and Hazel stood in the barn doorway for a moment looking at the empty road
and then went back to the house.
The children came home from school at 3:30, all four of them together, James and Will, with Ruth and Clara, which she noted since they'd fallen into the habit of arriving in two separate waves. They came in through the back door in a cluster, Ruth already starting to help Clara with her coat, Will talking about the sky, James silent. "Pa's not back," James said. He said it to the room, not to Hazel specifically, but he was watching her when he said it.
"Not yet," she said. Even. Like it wasn't the thing she'd been tracking since 2 o'clock. "He knows these storms," Ruth said. "He knows what to do."
"He does," Hazel agreed. But by 4 the rain had started. Not the slow warning kind, but the sudden full kind, like the sky had skipped the preliminaries. And by 4:30, it was coming in sideways, rattling the windows in their frames, finding the places where the glazing had gotten thin and spitting through. The light was wrong, dark too early, the color of iron. Hazel lit every lamp in the downstairs and put supper on the range and kept moving. She'd found, a long time ago, that keeping moving was the only reliable way to manage fear. Not suppressing it. The fear was there. She knew it was there. But giving it something to do. Her hands on the stove and the bread and the baby were hands that weren't shaking, and that was useful. Margaret had picked up on the tension in the house with the accuracy that babies have for the emotional weather of the adults around them, and was fussy and unwilling to be put down. Clara held her for a while, sitting in the rocking chair in the parlor with the baby on her lap, singing something low and not quite a real song, made up as she went. Emma sat beside them, one hand on the chair, adding her own quiet presence. Will watched the window. At 20 minutes past 5, the front door opened. She heard it first, the sound of the latch, the particular way it caught before it gave, and was already moving out of the kitchen when Cole came through it. He looked terrible. Not hurt, was her first thought, running the inventory automatically. He was standing, bearing weight on both feet, no blood visible. But he was soaked through completely, his hat gone somewhere, his hair plastered dark to his head. He had his left arm held at an angle that wasn't quite right, and when he reached for the door to push it shut, his face did something she wasn't supposed to see. She crossed the parlor in 4 steps and got to him before he could do anything with that expression. "Your arm," she said. "It's fine." "Cole." "I said it's fine. You're holding it like it's not fine." She put her hand on his right arm, the good one, and steered him toward the kitchen and away from the children. He went, which told her something. If he'd been genuinely fine, he'd have resisted just on principle. In the kitchen, she turned up the lamp and looked at him properly. He was white under the weathering. Not pale, white. The specific kind that comes from pain being suppressed for long enough that it starts costing something. "Take the coat off," she said. "It's just wrenched." "I'll tell you what it is after you take the coat off." He looked at her with the particular look of a man who has lived alone with his pain long enough that someone asking him to show it feels like a specific violation. She waited. He took the coat off. The left shoulder was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the horror of a fully dislocated joint, but the kind of wrong that meant something had given. He'd been riding out the fence line in the early part of the storm, and his horse had spooked at something, he told her in the flat recounting of a man editing the story down to its relevant facts. He'd come off. The horse had run. He'd walked 2 miles in the storm back to the ranch. 2 miles, she said, closer to 3 maybe. She pulled out the chair from the kitchen table and looked at him until he sat in it. He sat with the grudging quality of a large man who knows he's going to lose this particular argument, but is going to make sure it costs something. She'd learned basic field medicine from necessity. Her father's last year had required it. And what she knew told her the shoulder wasn't dislocated, but something in there had been pulled hard. She moved her hands carefully over the joint, watching his face, feeling the shape of the damage. "Tell me where," she said. He showed her by not quite flinching at the right place. "It needs to be wrapped," she said, "and you need to not use it for a few days." "I've got a ranch to... Obi can manage 2 days. Stop arguing." He stopped arguing, or rather, he stopped arguing out loud, which with him was about the same thing. She boiled water, found the strip cotton she kept in the medicine box, soaked a cloth for the heat and pressed it to the shoulder while she got the wrapping ready. He sat with his jaw set and his right hand flat on the table, not touching the cup of coffee she'd put in front of him and not complaining, and she worked around him. The kitchen was loud with the storm, the rain on the roof, the wind finding every gap, the windows rattling, and inside the lamp threw everything in amber, and everything outside the lamp circle was dark, and it felt very small and very contained in there, just the two of them, the noise of the storm and the quiet between them. "You scared me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. He looked at her. She was wrapping the shoulder now, focused on the tension of the cloth, not looking at his face. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I know you didn't." She tied off the end of the wrapping. The children were worried. Were they? James watched the window for an hour. Cole was quiet for a moment. James doesn't show things," she said. "That's different from not feeling them." He looked at the untouched coffee cup. She pushed it closer to his hand and he picked it up. "I hit the ground hard," he said. After a moment, like he was admitting something that cost him. "For a second I thought, I didn't know how bad it was, and I thought about them getting back here and—" He stopped, drank the coffee. "I started walking." "I know." 3 miles is a long time to think. She started cleaning up the things she'd used, putting the medicine box back together, because if she was doing something with her hands, she could keep her voice level. "What did you think about?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Whether they'd be all right. Whether you'd—" Another stop. He had an infuriating relationship with the ends of sentences, this man. "Whether you'd stay." She put the lid on the medicine box and set it on the shelf and turned around. "That's the second time you've wondered that," she said. "I know. I told you I was staying." "People say things," he said, "and then the situation gets hard enough and they—" He looked at the window. The rain was still coming in sheets, the lamp reflections fracturing in the wet glass. "3 women before you." "I know about the 3 women. Catherine's sister came after, for 2 weeks. Then she left. Said it was too much." He said it without self-pity, just as fact, in the tone of someone cataloging evidence for an argument. The preacher's wife organized meals from town for about a month. And then that stopped too. People have their own lives. I understand that. A pause. But the children kept watching the road. She stood across the kitchen from him and looked at him in the lamplight. The wet hair, the wrapped shoulder, the honest, exhausted face of a man who'd walk 3 miles in a storm because the alternative was not getting back. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Hazel, I am not leaving." She said it the way she said things that she needed to stick. Not loud, just solid. Not because of a storm, not because it's hard, not because I'm tired. I made a decision when Emma took my hand, and I don't unmake decisions. He looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She went to call the children for supper. They ate with the storm pressing against the windows and the lamp burning low and had to be refilled once, which Will did, because she'd shown him how, and he took the job seriously. The conversation at the table was loud by the standards of recent evenings. Cole was there, visibly, present in the way he hadn't always been, and the children responded to it the way children respond to the attention they've been waiting for, with an excess of energy and noise and competing for the floor. James was quieter than the others, but twice he spoke directly to his father, and twice his father answered, and neither of them acknowledged that this was different from before. After supper, after the children were upstairs and the dishes were done, and the storm had settled from violent to merely relentless, Hazel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the mending she hadn't finished, and the particular exhaustion of a day that had required more from her than she'd expected. Cole came back downstairs. She'd heard him say goodnight to all of them, his voice moving through the ceiling from room to room, and she'd kept working. He sat down across from her at the table, not with coffee this time, just sat. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked up. "About why I wrote the letter the way I did." He looked at his hands, at the table, back at her, that restless looking of someone building up to something. "I told you I simplified because the truth had put 3 women off. That's true. But it's not all of it." She waited. "Catherine ran this place," he said. "Not just the house, everything. The accounts, the calving records, the negotiation with the buyers in Albuquerque. I'm a fair enough rancher, I know cattle, I know land, but the running of it, the keeping track, she did that. And when she died, I didn't just lose my wife. I lost—" He stopped, Tried again. I lost the person who knew how everything worked. And you didn't put that in the letter. How do you put that in a letter? His voice had an edge to it, not at her, but at the situation, the inadequacy of language for certain things. Wanted. A woman willing to take over a life another woman built and hold it together while I figure out how to function again. Wages negotiable. That's actually more honest than orderly household, she said. He made that almost laugh sound again. Maybe. What is it you're actually telling me? He looked at her directly. That this is more than housekeeping, that it's always been more than housekeeping, and I knew that when I wrote the letter, and I didn't tell you because I didn't know how, and you deserved to know what you were walking into. I figured it out fairly quickly. I know. I'm telling you anyway. He paused. Because you said don't lie to you again. And not saying a thing is its own kind of lie. Outside, the rain pressed on. Inside, the lamp threw the same amber circle it had all evening, and the house around them was quiet with the specific quiet of children asleep and babies settled and the day's work done. Catherine's account books, Hazel said. Are they somewhere? He blinked. What? The accounts, the calving records. She kept them somewhere. In the desk in the study, I haven't... He stopped. I haven't opened it. I'd like to look at them, she said, if you don't object. He was quiet, something working through him that she could see in his face, the resistance and the relief of someone being offered help with the specific thing they've been avoiding. I don't object, he said. Good. She folded the mending she'd finished and added it to the pile. Tomorrow, when the storm clears. Hazel. She looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her with those honest gray eyes and the expression of a man who has more to say than he has words for, which, with Cole Mercer, covered a considerable amount of territory. Thank you, he said finally, for staying, for tonight, for... He stopped, catching himself mid-sentence in the usual way. Then with visible effort, he finished it, for acting like we're worth staying for. She held his gaze a beat longer than she had to. Get some sleep, she said. Your shoulder's going to be worse in the morning. He went upstairs. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a few minutes after, with the rain on the roof and the lamp going and the house around her full of sleeping people. And she thought about orderly households in Pennsylvania and $32 and a stagecoach that smelled like something dead. She thought about Emma's cold hands. She thought about James and the book left open on the kitchen table, and Ruth learning how to put weight down, and Clara's rock with the face in it, and Margaret reaching with both arms. She thought about a man who'd walked 3 miles in a storm, and whose first thought had been whether she'd be there when he got back. The rain kept coming. The lamp held. She finished the last of her tea and went to check on the baby before bed, the same as she did every night. And the floorboards under her feet were solid and known, and she moved through the dark house without a light, because she'd learned it well enough by now that she didn't need one. The storm left behind the particular kind of quiet that only comes after something violent has passed through. Not peaceful quiet, but the stunned quiet of a landscape still taking stock of itself. Hazel was up before the house, same as always, and stood in the back doorway with her coffee and looked at what the night had done. 2 fence sections down on the near side of the property. A section of the barn roof had peeled back at one corner, not badly, but enough that it would let water in if it rained again before someone fixed it. The garden she'd planted 6 weeks ago, cautiously, with the awareness that she had no guarantee she'd be here to see it, had taken a beating. The bean rows flattened and the young corn bent sideways. Not destroyed. Recoverable, if she got to it today. She made a list in her head and went inside to start breakfast. Cole came down slower than usual, the shoulder making itself known in the careful way he held his left arm, and the particular set of his jaw that she'd learned meant he was managing something he didn't intend to mention. She didn't ask. She handed him his coffee and told him about the barn roof and the fence, and he listened and said Obi could handle the fence and he'd look at the roof himself. Not with that shoulder, she said. It's fine. Cole. Hazel. They looked at each other across the kitchen. Obi can look at the roof too, she said. He drank his coffee. Obi's got enough to do. Then it can wait a day. If it rains, we'll put a bucket under it and it can wait a day. She turned back to the range. You walked 3 miles in a storm last night on a wrenched shoulder. You can let a roof wait 24 hours. He was quiet for a moment. "You're not particularly interested in what I think, are you?" "Not about this, no." She heard the almost laugh, let herself feel marginally satisfied. After she'd gotten the children fed and off to school, Will delivering his daily report on the storm damage as observed from the upstairs window, Clara carrying her lunch pail with the focused grip of someone transporting something valuable, James pausing in the doorway just long enough to say, "The garden's not that bad. I looked." She went to the study. She'd been past the door a dozen times and never gone in. It had felt like a boundary that wasn't hers to cross. But Cole had said the account books were in the desk, and she'd said she wanted to look at them, and she'd meant it. The study was a small room off the main hallway, barely big enough for the desk and a single bookshelf and a chair. It had the quality of a room that had been closed off, rather than abandoned. Someone had shut the door and not opened it again, and the stillness inside was of a different texture than the rest of the house. There was a framed map on the wall, a set of surveying tools in a leather case on the shelf. The desk was solid, well made, with 3 drawers on the right side and a flat leather writing surface worn pale at the center. Catherine had sat here. Hazel could feel the shape of it, the presence of a person in the specifics of a space organized around that person's habits. The pen stand positioned slightly left of center, which meant left-handed, or a preference. The small bowl on the corner of the desk, which had held something once and been emptied and not replaced. She sat down carefully. The account books were in the middle drawer. 3 of them, identical ledgers, the spines dated in neat handwriting that slanted to the right. She opened the most recent one and began to read. Catherine Mercer had been meticulous. The accounts were clear, organized, annotated in a small, precise hand that occasionally broke into the margins with observations that were more personal than financial. E. Taggart always lowballs the spring count, confirm with weight at loading, and the Albuquerque buyer, Hollis, prefers a written agreement even when they pretend otherwise. Not just records, but knowledge. The accumulated specific knowledge of a woman who'd understood every layer of what they were building here. Hazel read for 2 hours. She took her own notes in a separate piece of paper, working through what was current and what had fallen behind in the 14 months since the last entry. The picture that emerged was not catastrophic. Cole had kept the essential business of the ranch running, had sold cattle, had paid the major debts, but there were things slipping, small accounts not settled, arrangements Catherine had maintained with neighboring ranchers that had gone quiet because no one had followed up on them, a pattern of small losses accumulating in the margins. She was still at the desk when she heard Cole in the hallway, his step recognizable now, without having to think about it. He stopped at the open door. She looked up. He was looking at the desk, at the open ledger, at the margin notes in Catherine's handwriting. Something moved through his face that he didn't try to cover, and she was glad he didn't, because a man trying to cover something like that is harder to be present with than a man who lets you see it. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah." He wasn't, entirely, but he came and sat in the single chair across from the desk and looked at the wall and then back at her. "Find anything useful?" "A lot that's useful. Some things that need attention." She turned the ledger slightly so he could see what she'd been looking at. "There's a grazing arrangement with a rancher named Aldis. His land borders yours on the east. Catherine set it up 2 years ago. It looks like it lapsed because nobody renewed the agreement last spring." Cole's expression shifted. "I forgot about Aldis. Is the arrangement still one you'd want?" "Yeah, it's good land, and he gets fair use of the water on my north section in August when his creek runs low." He leaned forward and looked at the ledger. His shoulder made him wince slightly when he reached for it, and he made himself not react, and mostly succeeded. "I should have gone to see him months ago." "Write him a letter," she said. "Today. I'll take it to town tomorrow." He nodded slowly. "She would have done that the week after," he said. Meaning Catherine. Meaning the letter to Aldis. She kept track of every date on every agreement. "I see that." Hazel paused. "She was good. She was better at this than I was." He said it plainly, without self-pity, just as true. "At all of it. I knew cattle and land. She knew everything else." He looked at the margin notes, the small, precise handwriting. "I couldn't open this drawer. I tried once, about 2 months after. I opened it and looked at her writing, and I put it all back, and I didn't open it again." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because the dust on the drawer pull was undisturbed. Everything in here has been sitting exactly where she left it." Hazel closed the ledger gently. That's not a failing, Cole. That's just how long some things take. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger, at the pen stand, at the empty bowl on the corner of the desk, taking the room in the way you take in something you've been avoiding, finding that the thing was not as unsurvivable as you'd been afraid of. She would have liked you, he said. Catherine. She was particular about people, didn't take to everyone, but she would have liked you. Hazel didn't say anything for a moment. There wasn't an easy response to that, and she had no interest in an easy response. That means something, she said finally. Thank you. He nodded, looked at her notes. Walk me through what needs doing. So she did. They sat in that small room for another hour, going through what she'd found, and Cole answered her questions and added things she hadn't known, and between them they built a clear picture of where the ranch actually stood and what needed to happen in what order. He knew things she didn't about the land and the cattle and the people they dealt with. She knew things he didn't about the accounts and the arrangements and the margin notes his wife had left as a map through the operation she'd managed. Between them, they had most of what they needed. When they were done, Cole sat back in the chair and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the tiredness, not the guardedness, something cleaner. I've been doing this alone in my head for 14 months, he said. I know. It's different when someone else knows it. Yes, she said. It is. The shoulder kept him slowed down for 5 days. Hazel tracked this mostly through what she noticed and didn't mention. The way he came to meals earlier because he wasn't spending the usual long hours out with the cattle. The way he sat on the porch in the afternoons with something in his hands but not really doing it. The general difficulty of a working man forced to be still. What it meant in practice was that he was in the house more. It changed things, that simple fact. He was there when Emma woke from a bad dream at 3 in the afternoon and needed someone to sit with her, and it was Cole who sat with her, on the parlor settee with Emma tucked against his side and her dark hair against his shirt. And Hazel came downstairs from her mending and found them like that and went quietly back up without disturbing it. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand on the wall and felt something settle in her chest. He was there when Will came home from school with a split lip and the elaborate defensive story that meant he'd been in a fight he was going to claim was justified and might even have been. Cole listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was new, and then asked 2 questions that cut precisely to what had actually happened, and Will, surprised by the accuracy, told the truth. The conversation that followed was not a lecture. It was a conversation. Hazel heard it from the kitchen and did not go to listen more closely, but slowed down her work considerably. He was there the evening James finally brought one of the books to his father directly, instead of leaving it open on the kitchen table for Hazel to find. He stood in the doorway of the study where Cole had been trying one-handed to write the letter to Aldous, and he said, I read something you might find useful about land surveys, and held out the book, open to the page. Cole took it. Read the passage. Asked a question about it that was a real question, not a parent managing a child question, and James answered it and then corrected a part of Cole's answer, and Cole conceded the correction, and James looked slightly stunned by the concession, and then both of them looked at the letter and James pointed to something and said, You spelled Aldous wrong. And Cole said, How do you know how Aldous spells his name? And James said, I've seen the grazing agreement in the ledger. And Cole looked at him and said, You've been reading the ledgers? And James said, I read everything, as if this were obvious, which for James it probably was. Hazel heard that conversation too. She was getting good at hearing things from the kitchen without moving toward them. It was Clara who said it first. Of course it was Clara. They were at supper on the 4th day. Cole's shoulder still wrapped. The study letter to Aldous sent. The garden replanted in the storm's aftermath. The barn roof patched by Obie with Will's alleged assistance. And Clara was eating with one hand and arranging her spoon with the other in some private geometry. And she said without looking up, Are you going to stay forever, Miss Hazel? The table went still in the way that tables go still, when someone says the thing everyone has been carefully not saying. Clara, Ruth said. What? It's a real question. Cole was looking at his plate. Hazel looked at Clara, who had looked up now and was watching her with that open, direct expression that had no calculation in it whatsoever. I plan to, Hazel said. But you might not? Clara, Ruth said again with more weight. Plans are intentions, Hazel said. And my intention is to stay. She looked at the table, not at Cole specifically, at all of them. This is where I want to be. Will nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already concluded. Emma put a piece of cornbread in her mouth and looked at Hazel with those steady brown eyes, and there was nothing in them that looked like uncertainty. James said nothing, but the set of his shoulders was different. Some held tension releasing. Cole still hadn't looked up from his plate. After supper, after the children had scattered and the dishes were done, Hazel was in the kitchen going through the week's supply situation when she heard him behind her. She turned around. He was holding something. Small, fitted in his palm. He'd clearly had it somewhere and brought it out, and now he was standing in the kitchen doorway with it in his hand and the expression of a man who has decided to do something and is committed past the point of retreat. He held it out to her. It was a bird, carved from pale wood, cottonwood, she thought, the grain running through the spread wings in a way that looked almost natural, as if the bird had been inside the wood already, and he'd simply found it. It was small enough to sit in her palm, rough in the way of handmade things, but the detail in the wings was careful, considered. Someone had spent time with this. "You made this," she said. "I used to carve. Before." He shrugged, then remembered the shoulder and didn't. "I found the knife a few weeks ago. I've been doing it in the evenings." She turned the bird over in her hands. The wings were lifted slightly, not in flight exactly, but in the moment before flight, that poised second of decision. "Cole, I'm not good at saying things the right way," he said. "You know that." "I know that. So I'm not going to try to say it the right way." He looked at the bird in her hands, not at her face. "You came here for a housekeeping job. That's what you signed on for, and you've done more than that, more than anyone had a right to ask. And I know I got you here by—" He stopped. "I know the beginning wasn't honest, and I can't fix that, but I want—" Another stop, this one longer. "I want you to have a reason to stay that isn't about the children or the house or the wages. I want you to stay because you're staying for yourself, for what you want." She was still looking at the bird. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I think you know what I'm asking you. Say it anyway." He looked at her then, directly, fully, the way he rarely did with people, that honest gray gaze that she'd clocked on the first day and still hadn't gotten comfortable with. "Stay," he said, not as the housekeeper, as— He stopped himself again and then visibly decided he was done stopping himself. "Marry me, if you want that. If this is something you want." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the evening was coming in slow and gold, the way evenings came in this country when they weren't being violent, painting everything the color of something worth keeping. She looked at the bird in her hands, the poised wings, the moment before decision. "I came here with $32, she said. "I was going to leave the same day I arrived." "I know. I had plans. They weren't specific plans, but they were mine." "I know that too." She turned the bird over once more. The grain of the wood ran through the wings like water. "This is a real question," she said, "not one you're asking because the children need a mother or the house needs running or because it makes practical sense. I need it to be a real question." "It's a real question," he said. "It's the only real question I know how to ask right now." She set the bird down carefully on the kitchen table, looked at it there in the evening light. Then she looked at him. "Ask me again in the morning," she said, "when it's not evening and we're both tired and your shoulder isn't hurting." He looked at her for a moment, nodded. The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. She picked the bird back up and took it with her when she went to check on Margaret, because whatever the morning brought, she was not leaving the bird on the table. She held it while she stood over the baby's cradle and looked at Margaret sleeping with both small hands open, the way babies sleep when they feel safe. Thought about Pennsylvania, about the long, quiet winters and the walls closing in and the savings going thin. Thought about the stagecoach and the dead bird on the merchant wife's hat, and Harlow Creek and the dust, and the drive out to the ranch on that flatbed wagon. Thought about Emma in the doorway with her bare feet and her cold hands, and the question she'd asked with such matter-of-fact resignation. "Are you going?" She closed her fingers around the carved bird. She already knew what she was going to say in the morning. She thought he probably knew it too. But some answers deserved the full weight of being given in daylight, clearly, without the softening of evening or tiredness or the particular closeness that came after hard days. Some answers deserved to be chosen fresh, with nothing softening them. She put the carved bird on the windowsill beside Margaret's cradle where she'd see it in the morning light and went to bed. She was already up when the answer came to her, though that wasn't quite right because the answer had been there for weeks, maybe longer, sitting in her chest like something she'd been waiting to have permission to claim. The morning light came in through Margaret's window at an angle that turned everything pale gold, and the carved bird on the windowsill caught it and held it, the cottonwood grain glowing in a way it hadn't in the evening dark. Hazel stood in her doorway across the hall, dressed, coffee going cold in her hand, looking at the bird from a distance, thinking about the woman who'd gotten on a stagecoach with $32 and a folded letter and the specific kind of hope that only grows in people who've already lost everything once. That woman had been looking for orderly, for stable, for a life that stayed where you put it. What she'd found instead was messier and louder and harder than anything she'd planned for, and it had asked more from her than she'd known she had, and it had given her back something she hadn't had a name for until now. She picked up the bird from the windowsill, carried it downstairs. Cole was already in the kitchen. Of course he was. His shoulder was well enough now that he'd gone back to early mornings, and she'd heard him moving around down there before she got up. He was at the range with his back to her, and he turned when he heard her step on the last stair, and she could see from the way he looked at her that he'd been wondering all night what the morning would bring. She set the bird on the table between them. "Yes," she said. He went still. "That's my answer," she said. "In the daylight, not tired, not softened by the evening. Yes." He looked at the bird, then at her. The expression on his face was not the uncomplicated happiness of a man who's gotten what he wanted. It was more layered than that, relief and something almost like fear, the look of someone who's been handed something valuable and is suddenly aware of how breakable it is. "You're sure?" he said. "Not a question. A verification." "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't." He nodded slowly, picked up the bird, turned it in his hands the way she had the night before. There should be a ring. I don't have—" "That can wait," she said. "There are biscuits to make." He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it finished the job, became an actual smile, small and crooked and real, the first one she'd seen from him that wasn't undercut by something. "There are biscuits to make," he repeated. "The children will be up in 20 minutes. He put the bird in his shirt pocket, close to where his heart was, and went to put more wood on the fire. They didn't tell the children immediately, not because they were hiding it, but because the morning moved the way mornings moved. Breakfast and the business of getting 4 children organized for school, and Margaret fed and the day's work figured out. And there wasn't a clean moment. Will's boot had lost its sole overnight, which became the primary crisis of the first hour. Clara had left her arithmetic at school and was certain this was catastrophic. Emma moved through all of it with her usual steadiness, eating her biscuit and watching everything. It was Emma who said, at the end of breakfast when the others were putting on coats and gathering things, "Pa's different this morning." Cole, who was crouching down fixing Will's boot with a strip of leather in sheer determination, looked up. "Different how?" he said. Emma considered him. "Less heavy," she said. Ruth, who had been herding Clara toward the door, stopped and looked at her father, then at Hazel, with the older sister's instinct for subtext that she'd had since she was old enough to read a room. "Are you going to tell us something?" Ruth asked. Cole stood up, Will's boot temporarily functional. He looked at Hazel, that checking-in look, and she gave him a slight nod. "Miss Hazel has agreed to marry me," he said. "If that suits all of you." The kitchen went quiet for a beat. Then Will said, "Does that mean she stays forever?" "Yes," Cole said. "That's what it means." Will pumped his fist in the air with an enthusiasm that was completely unselfconscious and thoroughly 9 years old. Clara made a sound that was somewhere between a shriek and a cheer, and then grabbed Emma's hands and pulled her in a circle. Emma allowed herself to be spun, her expression not surprised at all, more the expression of someone watching a prediction come true. James stood in the doorway with his coat on and his school bag over his shoulder and didn't say anything. Hazel watched him. He was looking at his father with that same assessing look he'd worn for months, measuring, calculating the distance between what was said and what was real. Then he looked at Hazel. "You're actually staying," he said. "Not quite a question. Still not entirely not a question. I'm actually staying, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his bag and went out the door. And she heard his boots on the porch steps, and she thought that was all she was going to get from him. But then he stopped at the bottom of the steps and called back through the open door, his voice carrying the particular studied casualness of a 10-year-old boy who has decided something costs less than it actually does. Good. Then he was gone, the others streaming after him, and the sound of them faded down the road in the way of children. Sudden, and then nothing. Cole stood in the kitchen and listened to them go. Good, he repeated in James' exact tone. Hazel turned back to the dishes. Don't make fun. I'm not making fun. He was quiet for a moment. That's the most he said to me, and he used to say good morning, before, every day, without being told, and then he stopped. He paused. He started again about 2 weeks ago. She didn't look up from the dishes. I know, she said. I noticed. They were married 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in August, in the front yard of the ranch because it was the largest space available, and Cole had refused to do it in the church in town on the grounds that the preacher talked too long. The judge from the county seat, a compact, businesslike woman named Judge Hara, who seemed to find the whole arrangement sensibly practical, came out on a Thursday and made it legal with the minimum of ceremony and the maximum of efficiency, which suited both of them fine. The Saturday gathering was for the community, which Hazel hadn't expected, but Cole had apparently arranged, having apparently talked to Martha Holt at some point, which meant that everyone who was going to know about it already knew about it and had thoughts about it and was going to come regardless. So they set up tables in the yard, and Hazel made 3 pies, and Martha Holt brought 2 more, and a woman named Dora Aldis, wife of the rancher Cole had renewed the grazing agreement with, brought a ham, and about 30 people from Harlow Creek and the surrounding ranches came and ate and said things about the weather and the cattle market and how the children had gotten taller. It was not a graceful party. One of the long tables had a leg that wasn't quite right and listed badly, and they only caught it after a pitcher of lemonade had already gone sideways. Will got into something with another boy of similar age and had to be separated with the resigned authority of someone who had expected this. Clara attached herself to Dora Aldis and followed her around asking questions for 2 solid hours. And Dora Aldis, who apparently had a high tolerance for exactly this, seemed delighted by it. Margaret, making her first public appearance of any scale, was passed from person to person with the equanimity of a baby who'd been held by many different people and had strong opinions about all of them, but was willing to be diplomatic for the occasion. James stayed on the edge of things, the way he always did in crowds, with a book in his back pocket that he kept touching the way some people touch a worry stone. But once, about halfway through the afternoon, Hazel looked over and he was talking to one of the neighboring ranchers' sons, a kid about his age, dark-haired, intense-looking. In the focused, animated way he talked when the topic was something he actually cared about. She didn't know what they were talking about. She didn't need to. Ruth helped with everything. Not because she'd been asked, and not in the old way. The anxious, compulsive management of someone holding a household together through sheer will, but in the easy way of a person who helps because she's capable and present. And it makes sense. She refilled things when they ran low and redirected Will when necessary, and at one point found Emma sitting alone under the cottonwood at the edge of the yard and went and sat with her, and they stayed there for a while talking quietly, and Hazel watched it from across the yard and thought, she's going to be all right. They all are. It was not a perfect day. It was hot, and the displaced lemonade left a sticky patch on the ground that everyone tracked through for the rest of the afternoon. And at some point, Cole and one of the other ranchers had a discussion that was technically civil and clearly wasn't, something about property lines that had history behind it. Hazel extracted Cole from it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who'd been managing the social mechanics of this household for 4 months and had gotten good at it. "Everything all right?" she asked him quietly when she'd gotten him to the far side of the yard. "Fine," he said, in the tone that meant not entirely fine. "Who is he?" "Lester Gregg. His land borders mine on the south. We've had a disagreement about a water access for 3 years. Is it resolvable?" Cole considered this with the honesty she'd come to expect from him. "Probably, if both of us were less stubborn." "I'll talk to his wife," she said. He looked at her. "You'll talk to his wife. His wife probably knows exactly what the fair arrangement is,
and has been watching two stubborn men dig in about it for 3 years. Yes, I'll talk to his wife. He opened his mouth, closed it again. All right, he said. All right, she said.
The solution to the Gregg water access took another 6 weeks and a conversation between Hazel and Vera Gregg over coffee in Vera's kitchen, and then another conversation between Cole and Lester Gregg that was still not exactly comfortable, but ended with a handshake and a written agreement that Hazel drafted in the same careful format Catherine had used in the grazing arrangement with the Aldises. It wasn't graceful, it was just resolved, which was what mattered. The ranch changed in the months after, not all at once, and not without setbacks. There was a difficult month in October when 3 of the cattle came down with something, and they lost one of them, and the money was tight in a way that required careful management of everything. There was a week in November when Will got sick enough that Hazel sat up 2 nights running with him, and Cole came in on the second night and found her there and took over without discussion, and she went and slept for 6 hours and came back, and neither of them said anything about it except she made him coffee, and he said thank you. There were days when Cole went quiet in the way he went quiet sometimes. Not the old vacancy, not the absence she'd first seen in him, but the more private kind of quiet, the kind that meant he was somewhere with Catherine for a while. And Hazel learned to recognize it and leave it alone, the same way she'd want to be left alone with her own grief when it surfaced. Grief didn't ask permission, and it didn't keep a schedule, and anyone who expected it to was going to be perpetually surprised. But there was the other thing too, the growing thing, the way the ranch settled into a different shape as the months added up. The accounts were current. The arrangement with Aldis was renewed and extended. Cole had started sleeping more, not because things were easier necessarily, but because he wasn't carrying all of it alone anymore, and that turned out to matter in ways that showed up in small places. He was faster to laugh than he'd been. James had shown him something in a book about improved cattle rotation methods that Cole had initially been skeptical of, and then quietly implemented and been pleased by the results. And the fact that the idea had come from his 10-year-old son was something Cole mentioned with a particular pride that he tried to underplay and didn't entirely manage. Ruth, freed from the weight she'd been carrying since she was 11, had turned into something Hazel hadn't fully anticipated. Herself. She was sharp and quietly funny and had opinions about everything, strong opinions, held without apology, exactly like her father in the opinions, and exactly like her mother in the not apologizing for them. She'd started talking about wanting to study medicine, which she'd apparently kept to herself for 2 years because she hadn't thought it was possible, and Hazel had gone to the desk in the study and written a letter to a school in Santa Fe that she'd read about in a newspaper and brought it to Ruth and said, "I've written to ask what it would take. Start there." Ruth had looked at the letter for a long time. Then she'd folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress and said thank you, in a voice that was very even and contained. And Hazel had recognized that evenness because she'd used it herself when the thing being offered was too important to react to carelessly. Clara grew into the gap that Ruth had vacated. Not in the same way, Clara's particular style of management was cheerful and completely unaware that she was doing it. A child who organized people without ever noticing that's what she was doing. She was still asking questions at a rate that exhausted everyone around her, but the questions were getting more specific, more pointed. She'd started reading the books James left around, which James objected to on principle and tolerated in practice. Emma stayed Emma, steady and quiet, and there, taking things in with those brown eyes that missed nothing, offering comfort with the simple presence of someone who understood that being near a person is sometimes the whole of what's needed. She was the one who always knew where everyone was. She was the one who noticed first when someone wasn't quite right. She had gotten her mother's hair, but she had something that was entirely her own, a particular quality of stillness that the world had not yet managed to knock out of her, and that Hazel found herself hoping, with a fierceness that surprised her, that the world wouldn't. And Margaret at 13 months was a person with a schedule and opinions and a method of expressing displeasure that could be heard from the barn. She'd started pulling herself upright along the furniture with the determined fury of someone convinced that walking was possible and personally offended that it wasn't happening fast enough. She called Hazel Ma, which she called Cole too, and sometimes called Will, which they'd decided not to read too much into. She had Catherine's eyes and Cole's hair and whatever was entirely her own, which was still becoming. On a morning in November, about 7 months after the wedding,
Hazel was in the study going through the accounts when Cole came and stood in the doorway.
She'd made the study her own by degrees, not replacing Catherine's things, but working around them, adding to them. Her own pen stand positioned slightly right of center. A geranium on the windowsill because she'd always kept geraniums in Pennsylvania and had missed them. The 3 ledgers in the drawer alongside 3 new ones she'd started. "I want to show you something," he said. She followed him out through the kitchen and around to the back of the house, to the garden she'd planted in April and replanted after the June storm. It was November now, past the garden season, everything cut back and turned under for the winter. But Cole was crouching down at the edge of it with something in his hand. He stood up and held it out. A bulb, paper-wrapped, ordered from somewhere, recently arrived. "Tulips," he said. "You mentioned once that you had them in Pennsylvania, in your mother's garden." She'd mentioned it once, in passing, weeks ago. She didn't remember specifically when. She took the bulb from him. It was ordinary, brown and paper dry and round, nothing to look at in November. "They won't come up until spring," she said. "I know. You're planting something you won't see for 6 months. I know that too." He looked at the garden, at the turned earth, at the mountains beyond it with their winter cap of snow. "Seems like a reasonable investment." She looked at the bulb in her hands, thought about spring, which was a long way off, but was coming regardless, the way springs did. The tulips she'd had in Pennsylvania, red and yellow, her mother's voice telling her the names of the varieties, the way some things survived being dug up and carried to different soil and came up again in the new place, changed but not destroyed. "Help me plant them," she said. So they knelt in the November dirt together, the cold coming off the mountains, and pressed the bulbs into the ground one by one in the row she'd cleared. Their hands worked next to each other without commentary, finding the rhythm of it, the way you find the rhythm of things when you've been working alongside someone long enough. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach, the $32 and the folded letter, and the hope that only grows in people who've already lost everything. She thought about orderly household and what she'd thought that meant, and what she knew it meant now. An orderly household wasn't swept floors or straight lines or everything in its right place. It was this negotiated, imperfect, ongoing arrangement between imperfect people who decided that the trying mattered more than the getting it right. It was Ruth talking about medical school. It was James leaving books open on the table. It was Will bringing his daily report to someone who listened. It was Emma's hand in hers and Margaret reaching up with both arms. It was Cole in the kitchen doorway with a carved bird and an incomplete sentence and honest eyes. It was the geranium on the windowsill of a room that had belonged to someone else, and the tulip bulbs going into cold ground, and spring being a long way off but coming. She pressed the last bulb in and sat back on her heels and looked at the row of mounded earth. "My mother used to say that the things worth having always take longer than you want and cost more than you planned," she said. Cole pressed the soil flat with the back of his hand, the unhurried motion of someone who'd been working land long enough to know it had its own schedule. "Sounds about right." She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees. He stood beside her, and for a moment they both just looked at the garden, at what they'd planted, at the ground that held it. She had come here with 1 bag and $32, and the particular loneliness of someone who'd been running on empty for so long they'd forgotten what full felt like. She hadn't been looking for a family. She hadn't been looking for this man or these children or this stubborn, complicated, slowly healing place. But she'd gotten off the stagecoach anyway. She'd walked into a house that smelled like chaos and heard a baby crying and felt the whole thing pressing down on her like an impossible weight. She'd picked up her bag to leave, and a small girl with cold hands and bare feet had come to the door and taken her hand and held on without asking, and Hazel had set the bag down. That was the whole of it, really. Not a grand decision, not a moment of clarity or courage or certainty, just a small girl and a cold hand and the choice to stay 1 more hour and then 1 more day, and then the days had added up into something she couldn't have designed if she'd tried. The best things usually worked that way. Not chosen all at once, but accumulated, one small choice at a time, until one day you looked up and found yourself somewhere you recognized as home. She went back inside. Behind her, Cole stood at the edge of the garden for another moment, looking at the turned earth, at the invisible bulbs underneath it, at the spring that was months away and as certain as anything in this uncertain country. Then he followed her in. The door closed behind them both. Inside, the house was warm and loud. Will's voice rising over something, Clara laughing, the low, solid sound of the house being lived in by people who'd stopped being careful about it, who'd let themselves fill the space completely, the way you do when you're not afraid anymore of being asked to leave. Margaret pulled herself to standing at the kitchen table and shouted her triumph to the room, and everyone heard it, and everyone came. Some families are born into. Some are built, one act of staying at a time, by people who had every reason to leave and chose otherwise. The choosing doesn't make it easy, it just makes it real.